You're probably wondering today why I'm discussing the life and the writings of a Catholic father, Fray Servando Teresa De Mier. Fray is Spanish for friar or brother, and I will refer to him most commonly as Fray Mier, but sometimes in the writings he's called Dr. Mier. I was first introduced to Fray Mier when I met my wife. I was on an LDS mission in Mexico, 1962 to 64. I met my wife as one of the lady missionaries. We ended up getting engaged and getting married shortly after our mission. Her sisters told me the story that when the missionaries came to teach their family the Book of Mormon, that Erlinda says, "Oh, I learned that in school." And Erlinda and another woman were the first two converts to the LDS church in her hometown, and today there's a stake. One of the other things that I have learned is, other than Erlinda and a meeting I had in the 1990s with a group of Jesuit priests at a Catholic university in Mexico, that the identity of Fray Mier is probably none of you, unless you've visited with me or ever even heard of Fray Mier, and even in Mexico, he is virtually unknown. I had a member of the Chamber of Deputies from Mexico approach me in the 1980s as a consultant on political subjects. Chamber of Deputies is the same as our Chamber of our House of Representatives in our federal government. And he had never heard of Father Mier. But after visiting and getting to know each other and attending meetings here in Salt Lake, El Paso, Texas, and down in Mexico, he went to a meeting in Monterrey, Mexico, which was the birthplace of Father Mier, and ended up buying a biography for himself and mailed to me, which gave me an actual authentic history. But even prior to that, about 2 or 3 years after we were married, we're down in Erlinda's hometown of Los Mochis, and she slaps this book in my hand and says, "You've got to buy this." I studied this when I was a student. The book is published by the Autonomous University of Mexico, and the book that the deputy gave me is published by the Autonomous University of Nuevo León and the state of Nuevo León. So these are very authentic historical records, and later on I'll explain to you why it is that Father Mier is so little known. He was born in Monterrey, Mexico, which is kind of the industrial, intellectual center of Mexico. I've never visited there, but it's a fascinating area. It was settled in the early, in the late 1500s, about 1592, to my recollection. And it's unique in that it was settled by refugees, immigrants from Spain and Portugal, who were Jewish converts to the Catholic Church, and they were trying to get away from the Spanish Inquisition. Father Mier is descended from those original settlers, and as I've studied his life history and writings and so forth, it's very clear to me that he in his personal life and his family preserved and maintained Jewish customs and traditions. As a young man of going to school, his first years in school as a grammar student, probably 5, 6 years of age, was in a Latin school that had been funded by a widow. And Father Mier's writings read like it was a prospectus for a major investment, or like a legal opinion written by the Supreme Court. They're very complex, and I've had people tell me even the English translations of his writings that I've published in my books can be hard to read through. Father Mier uses numerous Latin quotes in his writings, and having studied Latin 2 years when I was in high school, I suddenly had an aha moment about 10 years ago when I said, you know, he's writing in Spanish, but the grammar and the sentence structure is in Latin. Just to give you a little insight of Father Mier and his styles. At 16 years of age, he went to Mexico City. He entered the convent of the Dominican order and eventually became an ordained priest of the Dominican order. He attended college at Puerto Coli in Mexico City, where he earned a doctorate of theology. At about the age of 31, he was such a recognized scholar in Mexico that the Mexico City council asked him to give a memorial or memory speech in honor of Hernan Cortés, November of 1794. It was so well received that the following month, the Catholic Church invited him to come to the Cathedral of the Virgin of Guadalupe and give a sermon December 12th, which is the anniversary day in Mexico. It's almost like a national holiday of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Father Mier, in his sermon, there is no known surviving copy of that sermon, but he sets forth in his defense of that sermon that he had two basic propositions. Number one, we were already Christians before the Spanish came. The theory that he put forth, and this theory was not invented by him. If you read any of the earliest Catholic missionaries, and he writes that the Catholic early missionaries were unanimous in finding that the people were already Christian. And if you, and so the theory was that the gospel had been brought to the Americas by St. Thomas. Most of you know St. Thomas, but you're not gonna connect with him. But St. Thomas was the doubting Thomas. What is not as well known is he was a very aggressive missionary for the church after the death of Christ. There are very few writings, but the early Catholic scholars would have been aware of this. He took the gospel as a missionary east into Asia, Persia, and into India. And in fact, is one of the three of the original 12 missionaries that is known where he is buried. And he's buried in a cathedral in India. And you may recall that in 1492, when Columbus arrived in the Americas, that he thought he had arrived in Asia, in India. The native people today are called Indians. The Caribbean area was often referred to as the West Indies. And so they would have known that Thomas took the gospel into India, and they thought they were in India. So that was how they came up with this theory. The second proposition, which was the really scandalous one, was he gave a very lengthy presentation apparently on the Virgin of Guadalupe. And the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico is the Catholic faith. And I won't go into a lot of detail on it right now, but his defense of the St. Thomas theory takes up about 5 pages, and his defense of the Guadalupe sermon portion takes up about 30 pages. And he was accused of denying the Virgin of Guadalupe. He did not deny the Virgin, but he goes into a very complex explanation of the connection between Virgin of Guadalupe and the ancient Christian faith. As a result of that sermon, however, he was taken out of the cathedral and put in prison. He was told while he was in prison that his doctorate of theology was taken from him. His priestly authorities were taken from him, and he was going to be deported to Europe. He was sent off to Europe, where he lived the next 27 years of his life. He was imprisoned in a convent in Spain, which is kind of an indication that he was perceived more as an enemy of the church rather than of the state. But he escaped, and it's further evidence that he escaped and got over to Portugal and lived in Portugal, and was actually hired by the Spanish ambassador to Portugal as a clerk and as an assistant in that office. Over the years, he immigrated, lived in France, up in England for a number of years, and over in Italy, back to Spain, until when he was in London, he met Francisco Mina, who was a Spanish military officer who was recruited and took Father Mier with him back to the United States, and from the United States into Mexico at the time of the fight for freedom from Spain. One of the very curious things is that the leaders of the revolution against Spain, Miguel Hidalgo and Jose Morelos, were both Catholic priests. They were captured by the Spanish and shot and killed. Father Mier was captured by the Spanish and turned over to the Catholic Church to be imprisoned. And so, again, it was further evidence that he was perceived as being an enemy of the church more than an enemy of the government. One of the very interesting things about Father Mier that I'd like to go into, that I learned in studying his history and so forth, is why is this history so hidden? Why is it so unknown? I learned meeting with a group of Jesuit priests, as I said, about 1991 or 92, that they study Father Mier's writings when they are studying to become priests. When I was a missionary in Mexico, I had a Catholic priest stop us in front of this cathedral, the plaza, compliment us on our good works that we were doing as missionaries, and encourage us to keep on pushing along. These were good people in this town. Many of them would accept our gospel message. The only thing that I could think to ask him, and we knew his name because he was so well known throughout the town, so we addressed him as Father Barajas. You know, why are you telling us this? What do you know about the Mormon church? He said, I read the Book of Mormon when I was studying to become a priest. And it's my suspicion at meeting 20, 30 years later with these Jesuit priests, that it's very common in the Catholic Church in Mexico for these priests. And my suspicion is Father Barajas had also read Father Mier. And my suspicion is that these Jesuit priests also read the Book of Mormon. You cannot disconnect the two of them. Father Mier's writings are a basic foundation for the cornerstone of our Sons of Utah pioneer heritage and our membership in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It is for the first time authentic history, culture, geography that validates the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. I'd like to very briefly just describe to you what happened to that history. And 3 points. Item number one was what in my book, I called the American Holocaust. National Geographic estimates in a program I watched on television about 5 years ago that the population of Central America was equal to that of all of Europe. Hernan Cortés was the first conquistador coming into Mexico, and he was astounded at the culture, the level of education, the infrastructure that the people had. And I'll remind you that Spain had been ruled for years by the Moors, and it was the enlightened culture and civilization of Europe. And yet it was far above what they had seen. What happened is the introduction of the European diseases killed off literally tens of millions of people. In addition to that, to give you a little example of the total disrespect, they had mammoth libraries, large libraries written in hieroglyphics and on paper documents that Hernan Cortés in 1519 gathered and burned. And then most of those surviving records were again gathered in 1526 by Bishop Juan Zumarraga, the first Catholic bishop of Mexico. So there were very few surviving records. The record keepers died, so the only records, and I'll read you in a moment a couple of brief quotes from Father Mier, were the biographies of the Catholic priests and missionaries who learned the language and wrote down and recorded the history of these people. The second thing that I learned, and it took me about 45 years to put these pieces together to figure out what happened, was slavery, and the slavery of the indigenous people. In 1503, the Spanish monarchy instituted a system of homestead, kind of like our U.S. Homestead Act, except that the immigrants from Spain would be given not only a grant of land, but they had such virtual control over the people that lived on that land that the Catholic fathers were sending back. This is slavery. They were also previously sent back records. These people are already Christian. The problem was, beginning 1403 to about 1526, there are about a dozen papal bulls. Most of them had been requested by Spain and Portugal because of their early entry into Africa, the Canary Islands, asking if slavery was permitted under Catholic Christian doctrine. And the Pope says, yes, it is permitted as long as the slaves are not Christian. And so the fact of the matter is, the Catholic fathers are reporting this encomienda system is a system of slavery, and they further testified these people are already Christian. And so what they had to do was they had to transpose the Virgin of Guadalupe image from Spain to Mexico, put her in the image of a native Indian woman, and use that as a means of making the people, they would speak Christians, but under a submissive Church Catholic doctrine. The second or the third point that I discovered is Father Mier lived was born 1763 and died 1827. When he returned back to North America, New Spain, and when they won their independence, he was an elected member of the Chamber of Deputies. In other words, he was a congressman, and he actually gave talks before Congress on these same subjects, and in some of the translated works that I have done. I have here a book which I'll share with you that I just published about 1998, and it is Fray Servando, the memoirs of Fray Servando Teresa De Mier, and it's published by Oxford University Press. And when I first discovered it, I thought in the 1990s, well, I don't need to worry about writing a book, it's already written. Well, Oxford University had the very same source books that are the subject of my translation of the writings of Father Mier. But they have written this as a memoir of Father Mier's years in exile in Napoleonic Europe, and it's kind of a travelogue of Europe in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And it's evidence, and they mention in the introduction that he was the subject to a inquisition, but they don't ever give any detail as to what the inquisition was. So it's evidence that, here's a renowned, well-known university publishing this book, and yet they are knowingly and willfully editing out, censoring anything that does with this subject of Christianity amongst the people. And I'll read to you out of Father Mier. When he came back also, he was put in prison, and he didn't have any of his library sources with him. There is no known copy of his sermon, but he wrote what it was a farewell letter, because he was told he was being exported or deported again. And Edmundo O'Gorman, who is the editor of the book that was published by the Autonomous University of Mexico, writes that he believes that this farewell letter that Father Mier wrote almost 27 years after his Guadalupe sermon is probably a summary of what he did in that sermon. And I'll just read you, three real quick sentences out of it as he's concluding his letter. He writes, "What was the Mexican religion but Christianity, confused by time and the mixed up nature of the hieroglyphics?" And just like out the Book of Mormon, that's what the fathers described their writing style. And then he counsels, "My fellow countrymen, stop howling and instruct yourselves." And then he closes, "The Deitists themselves today confess the ancient preaching of the gospel in America is beyond doubt." And my suspicion is one of the Deitists is referring to is the anthropologist Alexander Humboldt. And he writes in one of his memoirs that he met Alexander Humboldt in Paris, France. And Father Mier continued to give these sermons in his 27 years in exile in Europe and before Catholic congregations and symposiums. But he says Alexander Humboldt spent a year in Mexico while Father Mier was in exile. And he says, "I never believed a word you told me until I spent my year in Mexico." And some of the writings of Alexander Humboldt are a chapter in my book. Going to Mexico in 2013, we learned that, there's a statue of Alexander Humboldt in front of a national library in downtown Mexico. There's a plaque just down the street on the second store upstairs of a building that this is the room that Alexander Humboldt lived in for a year. He doesn't go into the religious topics, but he goes in, basically what he does document is there was a very elaborate education and writing system. And he discovered in 1805 that there were he only found throughout the world about 35 surviving records. And most of those are in the archives of the Vatican and in historical museums in Europe. So the third point that I wanted to make is it's my opinion that the reason you don't hear anything about Father Mier is because Oxford University, the Catholic Church in Mexico and so forth have connected this history to the Book of Mormon, and they don't want to put out in public anything that would give testimony or evidence of the Book of Mormon. With that, I will very quickly go into a summary of the chapter that I have, which is titled Mexican Anthropology's Contributions to Book of Mormon Historicity. And I list about 15 points contrary to what you have learned about there is no history or evidence of the Book of Mormon. As I go through this, you will find it. First off, written language. Mexico is the only place in the Americas, the Aztec, Mayan, and Zapotec people that had a written language. They had massive records that they kept on hieroglyphic records. And the records, to give you an example, were written on paper that came out of these maguey plants. We attended visited family 2013 down in Puebla and drove us up to Teotihuacan, which is a massive archaeological site, and went and saw an exhibit where the fellow took an obsidian blade and cut into these agave plants and came out with a piece of yellow wet paper about the size of this envelope. And he pulled a ballpoint pen and immediately sat and wrote a little brief message on it. There are numerous instances in the Book of Mormon to the people sending letters back and forth between each other in the time of war. And I would not surprise you to know that they probably weren't gold plates they were sending to their enemies, but they were able to out in the field, come up with a piece of paper that they could take a pen and an ink and write a message on. And the Book of Mormon is a written record. It's the only place in the Americas that they had a written language in libraries, and that was documented by Alexander Humboldt. In Father Mier's writings, or in his farewell letter, he begins with an introduction to the meaning of the word Mexico. And he says, we incorrectly pronounce our name Mexico. In Spanish, it's pronounced Mexico with a guttural sound. In English, it's Mexico. And he says the original word was Mexico, which is a Hebrew origin word. And the word translated to English is Messiah, or in Greek, to Christ. And he says Mexico, or Mexico, as we should pronounce it, is where Christ is worshipped. And he says to call someone a Mexican is the same as to call them a Christian. And this is right out of the Gospel of Alma and King Benjamin, where they said, we give you a name that you shall never lose except through transgression. And through transgression, we've lost the significance of the name, but the meaning is there. Mexico is where the Christ was worshipped. There are numerous references to the Book of Mormon about a land amongst many waters. We normally think that's the Finger Lakes, and that's the area close to where Joseph Smith found the gold plates in the Great Lakes area. But the ancient name of Mexico was Anahuac, and Father Mier in his writings often refers to his compatriots as Anahuacans, not as Mexicans, because the Mexican name apparently didn't come into common usage for what we now know as New Spain until after the Revolution. But Anahuac, I found in a writing of one of the Catholic priests that was about the time of Father Mier, translated means the land close to the waters. And Mexico City, if you've read into the history of the initial conquest, was a massive inland lake. And so again, those numerous references to battles and visits and so forth amongst the many waters was very would fit the description of Anahuac, or what we now call the dried sea of Mexico City, and close to what we are in Great Salt Lake, or close to studying that. I saw an article today, Salt Lake Tribune, about how we're going to conserve them and get the water back into the Great Salt Lake. To give you some geographic sites, there are numerous references in the Book of Mormon to traveling between the North Sea and the South Sea. I discovered that or that Catholic fathers in Mexico, and also one of the last surviving, Fernando Alva Ichitzotl, one of the last surviving descendants of the monarchs of the ancient Aztec, referred to going back and forth between the South Sea and the North Sea. And I'll show you very, very briefly this. I don't know if you can see it, this map. But the North Sea is the Sea of Campeche up here between the Yucatan Peninsula and the mainland of Mexico, and the South Sea is Tehuantepec. And the narrow neck of land is this very southern portion of Mexico, where it wasn't an insula or peninsula, but there was the sea coast on the west and the east was the high-rise mountains. And so there was an area where you could travel normally about a 3-mile stretch from the sea to the mountains. And this was Soconuco was the name, the ancient name of it, but it was referred to or Soconusco. Was often referred in the Spanish fathers' writings and the writings of the native people as a narrow strip of land. There are very few cities, but there is a city also in the very southern part of Mexico called Mitla, San Jose Mitla. And I discovered doing a Google search that there is a city in the Sinai Peninsula with the same name, Mitla. And the name is the same. It's desolation, the city of desolation. And I discovered that the original Zapotec name was a different spelling, but it meant desolation. And I've discovered that many of the names that we think is native names in Mexico were translations that the Spanish did by overimposing not Spanish, but many of them being from southern Spain and living in a Moorish heritage, that they transposed those Arabic names over into Mexico. The only other name that I have, and if you look on the map behind me, I have this copy of my cover of my book. I set forth is the city. You'll see up there. You'll see this is the volcanoes, Popocatépetl. This is the surrounding city of Cholula, Mexico, and this hillside here is actually a pyramid. And doing my Google search, I discovered not only is it a recognized archaeological site and a pyramid, it is the largest pyramid in the Americas, and it's larger than any pyramid in Egypt. It's not the tallest one, but the interior surface of it is the largest. At the top of that pyramid, the Spanish discovered a temple to Quetzalcoatl, which in Mormon heritage, people who've done studies, is presumed to be Jesus Christ. Father Mier doesn't refer to Quetzalcoatl as Jesus Christ, but he says he was one of the leading Christian or the founder of the Christian faith in the Americas. After the Cat Fathers discovered, they tore down the temple and they built this cathedral on top of it, the Cathedral of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Many of the Catholic fathers referred to Cholula as the religious center of the New Spain culture that they were invading. And in addition to that, Hernan Cortez talks about coming into town on the first 1519, climbing up into a tower and counting over 400 mosques. You don't find a mosque in the Book of Mormon, but you find numerous references to synagogues and the architectural style, the fact that they don't have images, but they have letters, are very, very common between the synagogue, the Jewish synagogue, and the Muslim mosque. But over 400 would indicate, and as I said, the writings were that this was the religious ceremony. Father Mier talks about Quetzalcoatl living, going out and teaching the gospel from this town. And it's just almost anything and everything that you read about in the Book of Mormon happened in Zarahemla, you'll find in the writings of the Catholic Father took place here in Cholula. So that's not a law, but I put forth as a speculation. The other interesting thing about the Book of Mormon is the numerous references to the law of Moses. And we often read, even in Mormon scholars, that there's no Christian evidence. Well, I included in my book the writings of two Catholic priests in the early 1500s visiting in the Yucatan Peninsula. And they were surprised to find that these people were living the law of Moses. And they list about a dozen different practices that you can find in the Old Testament, and there are numerous references in the Book of Mormon to the law of Moses. Matter of fact, the term law of Moses is used more frequently in the Book of Mormon than it is in the Bible. And one of the more curious things is that they both list was the practice of circumcision. And you may recall that that was a controversial subject in the writings of St. Paul in the New Testament. But Father de las Casas, who was one of the earliest putters together of this history, It says circumcision was the only place that was practiced in the Americas was in the Yucatan Peninsula. And he goes on to further describe it. He says, outside of the Middle East, from Turkey down to what's now Palestine, Israel, Egypt, Ethiopia, it was the only place in the world outside of the Middle East where it was practiced. Father Mier, in his farewell letter, talks about the people having built a temple in similitude of the Temple of Solomon. And not only that, but one of the curious things that he makes is the very common practice of the savage treatment of the people of human sacrifice. Father Mier writes that the practice of human sacrifice was more common in Spain than it was amongst the native people of the Americas. He doesn't go into any more explanation of that, but my suspicion is, if you've ever read History of Spain, was the Inquisition and the burning of stake of witches and people who were falling away from the faith. I've already told you about his sermon, but Father Mier insisted in a speech that he gave before Congress, and he includes it in his farewell letter that he wrote in 1820, that the Spanish pronounced the name Tomás, but the native people pronounced it Tomé. And in his farewell letter, he says, and Tomé had taught the gospel with Bartolomé. And I looked that up on a Google search, and I found Bartolomé is a Portuguese variation of Bartolomé or Bartholomew in English. And Bartholomew, if you look it up in your English dictionary, is son of Talmai, T-A-L-M-A-I. In other words, Alma, but with a T and an I. And my speculation is that it was probably a slight misspelling of the actual name of the person that taught the gospel. And they even talked about, some of the Catholic priests wrote about how the gospel was sent forth by 4 noble, virtuous youths who I speculate are the 4 sons of Mosiah. I mean, there's so many parallels like that. On the Virgin of Guadalupe is so complex. I'm not going to go into big definition, but in his farewell letter, he has a little 1-sentence statement that reads like out of 1 Nephi, I think about chapter 8, where Nephi is writing about the Mary, the mother of the Son of God. And it's just a real parallel to that story. It's been written by Hugh Nibley that honeybees were unknown in the Americas before they were introduced by the English into Jamestown. Well, Hernán Cortés in 1519, which was almost 200 years before Jamestown was settled, comes into the island of Cozumel and talks about the unusual form of agriculture. These people are keeping bees. And I put forth in my book, it was a very small bee. It was different than the European or the African version that the Jaredites, when they came over, they didn't bring stinging bees with them aboard their ship, but they did bring the technology. And I attended an anthropological seminar about 4 years ago at the University of Utah, and there was a professor there from the University of Guatemala, and he says, yes, beekeeping is still very common in Central America, and it's a native species which is not used up here in the United States. Another cultural evidence is the practice of drunkenness, wine, and so forth throughout the Book of Mormon. There's only one place in the Americas that I have been able to find where the practice of an alcoholic beverages was common, and that was in Mexico. And it was the crushed leaves of the agave plant, which they would make what in Spanish in Mexico we call pulque, which is refined into what we call as tequila or mezcal. The other drink was tepache, which was fermented pineapples, which were juice, which are native to Mexico. But alcohol was so pervasive in Mexico that the native people had very strict requirements. Basically, you were not allowed to drink unless you were an elderly person, and it was given to you as medication to relieve pain and so forth. If a common person was found drunk, the penalty for that was death. They were killed for being drunk. That's how pervasive it was. The nobility weren't that strict, but writing the Catholic Fathers, one of the major downfalls to the native culture and civilization with the Spanish did away with that ancient word of wisdom practice on the alcoholic beverages. And the drinking of alcohol became very pervasive under the reign of the Spanish. And the Fathers write about it being a major contributor to the downfall of the complete civilization. The ethnicity, Father Mier in his farewell letters talks about a religious practice amongst the native people where the priests yearly would gather the children around them to give them a blessing. And it reads just to my mind, just like Third Nephi, Christ gathering the children and blessing them. Father Mier writes that the ancient Christian practice before the Spanish came was that those children had to be blonde, blue-eyed, fair-haired children. So it's evidence that before the Spanish came, that there were white and delightsome people. And I've got here I'll show you, I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but this is a hieroglyphic writing, which is in the manuscript, the hieroglyphic of the Library of the Vatican. And if you look over here, you'll see two warriors fighting. Yeah, right there, right here. And one of them's white and one of them's brown. And so it's evidence, and this was one of the original hieroglyphics that Alexander Humboldt discovered. And there are one or two other images around there that are images of white warriors as well as brown warriors, so a divided society. One of the very curious things that I learned is over my years of study is that the earliest immigrants into Spain were Jewish. And as a matter of fact, I heard of a DNA study that was done where they were trying to find out what percentage of the native people, or the people of Spain, excuse me, had Moorish Arabic ancestry. And the number they discovered was only 5%. What they weren't looking for was the percentage of Spanish today who have Jewish ancestry is 75%. And so in my book, they've done DNA studies and they've discovered the native people do not have Jewish ancestry. But in my book, I speculate if you went to Mexico City and went door to door, probably 90, 98, 99% of those people would have Jewish ancestry. The question is, does that come out of their native ancestry or out of the Spanish ancestry? And to give you a DNA study, 2018, my wife and I did a DNA study. I came across as 21% Jewish. I have a Jewish grandfather, 3 old Mormon pioneer grandparents. My wife, Erlinda, did her DNA study, and she wasn't anywhere aware of it, had never heard of it. She's 1% Jewish, and there's no tradition of that at all. And as I said, if you went door to door in Mexico, I think you would discover that is part of the heritage. And then I'll close with one last comment. There are numerous critiques of the Book of Mormon for discussing animals and so forth. Alexander Humboldt in his writings does not delve into any of the religious topics, but at one point he discovers that one of his hieroglyphics, there was specific reference to elephants down in Mexico. And so I'll leave that as the elephant in the room to study. And Val, I'll take any questions or any comments anyone wishes to share.
Thank you, Gary. I really appreciate your presentation. I didn't see any questions that came up in the chat box, So I'll open it up in case somebody has a lingering question. We'll take one or two if anybody does. So unmute yourself and you can ask a question.
How do you get the book?
Oh, well, they're listed on Amazon. And also to give you an insight, my editing staff, Deidre Paulson, was here, but she had to go. She had a doctor's appointment. And Dr. Paul Hoskinson, who was the director of Neil A. Maxwell Institute, recommended that after a meeting I had with him about 10 years ago that I needed to get this in writing because he says no one else in the church is writing it. Well, as I was writing the book, I discovered that Mormon Archaeology had a website where they had posted an extracted copy of Father Mier's farewell letter on Christianity, and they titled it as Christian Myth. So it grew to where I translated Father Mier's Apology, his defense, which is a very difficult reading, and I was advised to divide it into 2 books. So this one I have with a picture of Father Mier is Fray Servando Teresa De Mier, Writings on Ancient Christianity and Spain's Evangelism of Mexico. And it's written as an academic work. The work, editing that part out of it, that is intended more for LDS and the people that are participating today and listening to this, is Christianity in the Americas Before Columbus, with a subtitle, Unfamiliar Origins and Insights. And the unfamiliar origins and insights, as I've already introduced you to, are the writings of the Catholic missionaries to Mexico. And then this was a paperback, and I think sells for $17.94 was what I recommended the price. And I picked that price as the date of the anniversary of Father Mier's sermon, $17.94.
Very good. Thank you, Gary. We can take one more question. Does anybody else have one that you'd like to ask?
If nobody else has a question, if I may, Gary, and thank you for your reference to the Jewish populations in Mexico. I know that prior to the Inquisition in Spain, the Jews and the Moors actually had quite a good working and living relationship together. How
Yes.
was the relationship between the Christians and the Jews in Mexico?
Well, to give you an insight, my Jewish grandfather was born in Lithuania, immigrated to Chicago, ended up in New York, marrying a Mormon girl. Maybe her brother Charles maybe became governor of the state of Utah. So after my grandfather died, we learned that there was a oral history that about 1780, the family had immigrated from Spain up into Lithuania and Russia. And so as a result of that, I've done extensive study on the topic. Most people aren't aware of it, but the Spanish Inquisition was instituted in 1492. These Moors were kicked out of Spain, and Queen Isabel and Ferdinand told the Jews who had lived there for thousands of years, convert or get out. And the sort of the urban legend is they converted and got out. But in a book that I read on the subject, the Jews were originally settled by King Nebuchadnezzar, and then that's part of the Spanish culture, and it's a numerous population. At the time of 1492, they were asked. They wrote to the rabbis in Turkey, "Please accept us," and the rabbi says, "No, stay and become Christians. You've lived there for thousands of years." I mean, 600 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar, to 1492 is 2002 years, I think, or something like that. And as a result of that, and they also recommended to protect yourselves, have your sons become Catholic priests. And I've discovered that many, as I speculated earlier, Father Mier, Father de las Casas, I've documented, were both of of Jewish heritage, and my suspicion is many of the others. In about 1560, 1590, the Catholic Church and the Spanish monarchy became very concerned that the massive number of the immigrants coming into Mexico and the New World were what are called conversos, converts or new Christians, the Jewish converts. And so they instituted the Inquisition about 1600, 1630 in Mexico. The interesting thing is many of those people, when they came into Mexico City to arrest them, would disappear. And for example, to give you an insight, we have a very large Latino Hispanic population in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. There was an article published in Smithsonian magazine about 2006 where they came across a study where they were the commonality of breast cancer amongst the native Hispanic people of the Western United States was common, that they wanted to identify the gene so they would begin having breast cancer and examinations, mammograms and so forth at the age of about 35. What they were surprised to learn was that gene was a gene very common amongst Eastern European Jewish women. In other words, the overwhelming majority of what we think is these old Spanish immigrants up into the north of Mexico were in fact Jewish convert heritage that were coming to our territories that we call the Western States, the United States, to escape from the Inquisition. That's probably more than you wanted to know about it, but